The house had stood there for decades, a quiet sentinel in the heart of Beverly Hills. It was a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion, draped in ivy, its arched windows catching the last golden rays of the sun. Once owned by the legendary Al Pacino, the estate had recently changed hands, purchased by a wealthy couple from New York, Elliot and Vanessa Mercer. Elliot, a venture capitalist with a taste for history, had been drawn to the home's undeniable charm, its winding hallways, and its sense of quiet grandeur. Vanessa, a former art curator, had fallen in love with its towering library, lined with books that bore the faintest scent of old parchment and time. The idea of living in a house once inhabited by a Hollywood icon only added to the appeal. But from the moment they moved in, the house made its presence known. At first, it was subtle, strange flashes of light, flickering just at the edge of their vision. They assumed it was faulty wiring or perhaps some quirk of the California sun bouncing off the windows. But then came the noises. The attic, an expansive, dimly lit space they had yet to furnish, seemed to breathe on its own. At night, when the world outside was silent, they would hear faint rustling above them, a scurrying almost. Then, something heavier, a shuffle, a dragging sound that made Vanessa clutch at Elliot's arm. Just an old house settling, Elliot muttered the first few times, though he couldn't explain why the noises always seemed to come at the same time just past midnight. But the library was the worst. Vanessa had been in there alone one evening, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound books, when she heard them muffled voices. Low, indistinct, as if coming from the walls themselves. She froze, her breath shallow. The whispers didn't form words, not exactly, but there was something almost familiar in their cadence, as if someone or something was having a conversation just out of reach. The house, it seemed, did not like to be empty. The staff had their own stories. The housekeeper, an older woman named Maria, refused to step foot in the attic. The gardener mentioned that sometimes, late at night, he saw movement in the windows, shadows shifting when no one was inside. Even their dog, a loyal golden retriever named Jasper, had begun growling at the staircase for no apparent reason. Elliot and Vanessa did their best to ignore it, until one night when everything changed. They had hosted a small dinner party, a few close friends, wine flowing, laughter filling the grand dining room. But as the evening wound down, one of their guests, an actress known for her sensitivity to the supernatural, grew visibly unsettled. "There's something here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot chuckled, trying to wave it off. Sure, maybe Al Pacino left behind some movie magic, but the woman wasn't laughing. Her eyes flicked toward the darkened hallway leading to the library. No, something older. That night, as Vanessa lay in bed, she swore she heard the faint echo of footsteps in the corridor. Slow, measured, coming closer. She held her breath, her heart pounding. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the footsteps stopped. The house fell silent. But she knew, deep in her bones, that it was only waiting for the next night. The air inside the house had changed. It was something neither Elliot nor Vanessa could explain, an almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere, like the thickening of humidity before a storm. The walls, once bathed in the warm glow of afternoon sunlight, now seemed darker, as if the very bones of the house were absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Shadows stretched a little too long in the corners of the rooms. The faint scent of aged wood and old books, once comforting, now carried something else, something stale, like the breath of time long forgotten. Vanessa found herself avoiding the library after sunset. By day, it was still hers, a sanctuary of knowledge and elegance, where the golden light from the windows painted shifting patterns across the polished mahogany floor. But at night, the towering bookshelves seemed to lean inward, pressing against the air, listening. The whispers had grown clearer, forming something just shy of words, and though she could not understand them, their cadence sent shivers down her spine. She tried to tell herself that it was nothing, perhaps the wind slipping through unseen cracks, or the echoes of the house itself shifting with age. But a part of her knew better. Elliot, ever the skeptic, dismissed her fears. "You're just letting that ridiculous dinner party get to you," he murmured one night as they lay in bed, his arm draped lazily over his forehead. Old houses make noise. As wood stone pressure it all moves. Vanessa turned her head against the pillow, watching the dim outline of him in the darkness. No, this is different. He exhaled, long and slow, before turning to face her. You want me to check the library? His voice was light, teasing, but she could tell he was only humoring her. She shook her head. No, because she was afraid of what he might or might not find. But the house had already decided it was time to be noticed. That very night, just as the weight of sleep began to press down on her, something pulled her back to wakefulness. A noise, soft at first, then growing faint shuffling footsteps in the hallway just outside their bedroom. Steady, deliberate, pattern, like someone pacing, her breath hitched, her body frozen beneath the covers. She reached for Elliot, fingers pressing against the warmth of his arm. He stirred, shifting slightly, but did not wake. The footsteps paused. A silence stretched out, heavy and listening. Then the sound resumed, but closer this time. Right outside their door. Vanessa's throat tightened. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had Maria returned late at night? Had the gardener come inside? But no. She knew, with a certainty she did not want to acknowledge, that it was neither of them. The doorknob rattled. Not violently, not with force, just a slow, almost tentative movement, as if someone on the other side was testing it. She barely dared to breathe. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. Minutes passed. Long, aching minutes in which Vanessa lay rigid, heart pounding against her ribs, eyes locked on the door as if it might swing open on its own. The house felt different again, calm, but not in a reassuring way. More like something had decided to retreat, or to wait. She told Elliot in the morning, expecting him to laugh it off, but he only frowned, running a hand through his dark hair. I did hear something last night, he admitted, though his voice was low, almost reluctant. I thought I was dreaming, but I remember. The knob. The words hung between them. And then there were the lights. Flashes, brief, inexplicable bursts of brightness that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Sometimes in the hallway, other times in the stairwell, always just at the edge of their vision. They weren't the flickering of a faulty bulb or the glow of passing headlights. These were different, sudden, contained, unnatural. Once, as Vanessa stood at the kitchen sink in the late afternoon, rinsing a glass, she caught sight of one in the reflection of the window. A quick burst of light behind her, near the library doorway. She spun around, but the space was empty. Elliot saw them too. He said nothing for days, but one evening, as they sat in the grand living room with its towering ceilings and heavy velvet drapes, he finally admitted it. It's not just you, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I saw one in the hallway last night. Just for a second. He rubbed his jaw, his expression unreadable. Like a camera flash, the comparison sent a chill through Vanessa. Maybe it's an electrical issue, she offered, though the words felt thin, empty even as she spoke them. Elliot didn't respond. The housekeeper quit the next morning. Maria had always been polite, professional, but that day, she would not meet their eyes. I cannot work here anymore, she said simply, standing near the grand entrance, her small suitcase in hand. Maria, please, if something is wrong. She only shook her head, gripping the rosary that always dangled from her wrist. It does not like you here. Then she turned and left. The house loomed around them in silence. Outside, the Beverly Hills sun still shone. The palm trees swayed in the breeze, and the world went on as if nothing was amiss. But inside, the whispers continued, and something, just beyond the veil of the known, was watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The days in the house stretched long, carrying with them a strange stillness, a sensation that something unseen coiled itself within the walls, waiting. It was no longer just the whispers in the library or the flashes of light in the halls. There was something deeper now, something that had taken root, weaving itself into the air they breathed, the very fabric of their existence. The house no longer felt like theirs. Vanessa woke each morning with the uneasy feeling of having been watched during the night. Not just the abstract paranoia of an overactive mind, but a physical certainty, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into her dreams, the sensation of breath stirring just beyond the edge of wakefulness. The air in the bedroom always felt slightly colder than the rest of the house, but only just enough to make her doubt her own perception. The moment she sat up in bed, the feeling would slither away, as though it had never been there. Elliot, for all his rationality, had grown quieter, distracted. He brushed it off as work stress, but she knew him too well. She noticed the way his hands lingered on the light switches before turning them off at night, how his gaze would flick toward darkened doorways as he passed them, how he never let himself be the last one up anymore. Then, one evening, it happened. Vanessa had been in the kitchen, leaning against the marble countertop, scrolling through her phone. The sky outside was a deep purple, the last dregs of daylight slipping away, casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. And then, a sound. Not the muffled voices from the library, not the scurrying in the attic, but something new, something closer. A breath, soft, deliberate, unmistakably human, came from right behind her. She froze. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. The air around her grew thick, pressing in against her skin, and the fine hairs along her arms stood on end. The breath had been so close, just inches from her ear, as though someone had leaned in to whisper but decided against it at the last moment. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. The doorway to the dining room gaped open, leading into darkness. The air still felt heavy, charged, as if whatever had been there had only just receded into the shadows, waiting. She gripped the edge of the counter, forcing herself to breathe. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She wanted to call for Elliot, but her voice felt trapped in her throat, caught somewhere between logic and terror. Then, just beyond the dining room, past the hallway leading toward the library, a light flickered. Not the overhead lights, not a lamp. It was one of those flashes, the same ones they had been seeing for weeks now, the ones that had no source, no explanation. It flared bright and sudden, illuminating the corridor for a fraction of a second before vanishing into the darkness. She couldn't move. She watched, breath shallow, waiting for something else, anything to happen. But nothing came. The silence stretched, thick and impenetrable. And then, from the hallway, the soft creak of a floorboard. That was enough. She turned, nearly stumbling as she rushed toward the living room, toward the sound of the television, where Elliot was sitting with his laptop, oblivious. He looked up as she entered, immediately noticing her pale face. "Vanessa? What's wrong?" She hesitated, swallowing the dryness in her throat. "Something's in the house," she whispered. Elliot set his laptop aside, his brows knitting together. "Vanessa, I felt it," she insisted, voice low but urgent. "It breathed on me, right behind me, and then the light. One of those flashes." Elliot pushed himself to his feet, jaw tight. He was still trying to convince himself there was a logical explanation, but she could see the unease in his eyes, the way his muscles tensed. "Okay," he said carefully. "I'll check it out." "No," she said immediately. But he was already moving, striding toward the hallway with forced confidence. Vanessa trailed behind him, unwilling to be left alone but terrified of what they might find. The hallway was darker than it should have been. The house had always been well lit, but now the shadows pooled thickly in the corners, stretching unnaturally long. The library door was slightly ajar. Elliot reached out and pushed it open. The room yawned before them. The massive bookshelves loomed, their spines gleaming in the dim light. Everything looked undisturbed. Then, a whisper. Not in the walls. Not distant. Right next to them. Vanessa's entire body locked up, her breath caught in her chest. It had been clear this time, a distinct voice, though the words were unintelligible. A soft, hushed murmur, as though someone stood between them, unseen. Elliot exhaled sharply. "You heard that," he murmured. Not a question. A statement. Before Vanessa could answer, another whisper followed. This time it was closer. And then the bookshelves shifted. A slow, scraping sound of wood against wood, the unmistakable creak of weight pressing against the shelves. It was as if something had leaned against them, disturbing their perfect stillness. One of the books tilted, then toppled, falling to the floor with a soft thud. Vanessa took a step back. Elliot stood frozen, his face pale. And then, from deep within the room, where the shadows were darkest, a light flickered, not a flash, a glow, soft and pulsing, like the dying embers of a fire. It came from the farthest corner of the library, where the bookshelves met the wall. The glow deepened, shifting, stretching. And then something moved. Not a person, not something solid. A figure indistinct, barely more than a silhouette of darkness against darkness. But it was there, watching. Vanessa grabbed Elliot's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to go," she whispered. For the first time since they had moved in, Elliot didn't argue. They backed away, step by slow step, the library door creaking as it swung closed behind them. The house did not protest, but it did not need to, because now they both understood. It wasn't just that something was there. It was waiting for them to realize it had been there all along. The house did not sleep that night, even after Vanessa and Elliot had retreated to their bedroom, locking the door behind them as if a simple latch could keep out something that did not belong to the world of locks and keys. The feeling remained, thick and inescapable. The air was heavier, carrying a weight they could not name, a presence that settled into the corners of the room like something breathing just beyond their sight. Vanessa lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, where the darkness pressed down in uneven patches. She could hear Elliot's breathing beside her, slow but not steady. He was awake too. Neither of them had spoken since they left the library, but there was no need. They both understood now. The house was aware of them. It was not some residual energy trapped in the walls, some echo of time long past. It was something alive, and it was watching. The silence stretched unbearably long. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, whispering against the windows. The occasional car passed down the distant streets of Beverly Hills, but the sounds were far away, separate from them, as if the house existed in a space apart from the rest of the world. Then, just as Vanessa's breathing began to slow, just as her body started to ease into the pretense of sleep, the bed shifted. Not a creak, not the settling of the mattress beneath their weight. A shift, a pull, a slight, deliberate movement, as though someone had pressed down on the edge of the mattress, as though someone unseen had taken a seat at the foot of their bed. Vanessa's breath stopped in her throat. She felt Elliot tense beside her. Neither of them moved. The air changed again. It was colder now, an unnatural chill that curled over her arms, raising goosebumps along her skin. The presence was there, no longer lurking at a distance, no longer confined to the library or the attic or the halls. It was here, in the room. Then came the whisper. Not from the walls this time, not from the library or the darkened corners of the house. From right beside her ear. It was not a word. It was not a language. It was something else, a murmur, a breath, a sound that did not belong to the living. It was close enough that she felt the movement of air against her skin, close enough that every nerve in her body seized with ice-cold terror. She couldn't move. The weight on the mattress shifted, slowly, almost curiously, and then the blankets were pulled, not yanked, not violently, just the faintest movement, a slow, careful tug, as if unseen fingers had curled into the fabric and drawn it down by mere inches. Vanessa's body reacted before her mind could process. She sat up with a gasp, her hands clutching the blankets, yanking them back toward her, her entire body trembling. Elliot shot up beside her, his breath sharp, eyes wide in the darkness. He had felt it too. Then came the sound, a whisper of movement, a breath of fabric shifting, just beyond their bed. And then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor, toward the door. Elliot reached for the lamp. The moment his fingers brushed the switch, the footsteps stopped. Silence. He hesitated, then flicked the light on. The room flooded with soft, golden light. Everything was still. The blankets remained clutched in Vanessa's fists. The door was closed. And yet, the air still carried the weight of something that had been there only seconds before. Elliot exhaled a shaking breath, rubbing his face. "That's it," he muttered, voice rough. "We're leaving." Vanessa barely registered his words. Her heart was hammering in her chest, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, to get out of this house before it was too late. Because this wasn't a haunting. It wasn't some nameless entity moving through the house like a ghost tied to old memories. It was something else. Something intelligent. Something patient. Something that had been waiting for them to notice it. They left the next morning. Neither of them spoke as they packed hurriedly, stuffing clothes into suitcases without care, throwing essentials into bags without pausing to fold or organize. The house was silent as they moved through it, but the silence was not an absence of noise, it was aware. Watching. As Elliot carried their bags toward the front door, Vanessa hesitated in the hallway, glancing back toward the library. The door stood ajar, the darkness inside undisturbed. But the books were different. She could see it from where she stood. The shelves, always orderly, were slightly askew, as though someone had been running their fingers along the spines, pulling some forward, pressing others back. A pattern, but not one she understood. Then her gaze dropped lower. A single book lay open on the floor. Not the one that had fallen last night. A different one. The pages were old, yellowed with time, but the words on them were crisp, clear. She stepped closer, almost against her own will, her pulse thudding in her ears. The text on the page was underlined in deep, black ink. "You cannot leave." A breath caught in her throat. Behind her, Elliot called, "Vanessa, let's go." She didn't look back. She grabbed the book, slammed it shut, and shoved it onto the nearest shelf, not caring where it landed. Then she turned and ran to the door. The moment they stepped outside, something shifted. The air felt lighter, the sun brighter, the world real again, as if they had emerged from a place that did not belong to this world. Neither of them looked back as they drove away. But Vanessa felt it deep in her bones, in the space just behind her mind, where rationality and instinct met. The house was not done with them. Not yet. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.